I'm on a supervised visitation for a court-ordered visit, and something really weird has happened. The kids went into the house, and the parent, the biological parent, whose name is Josh Powell, will not let me in the door. I'm really shocked, and I could hear one of the kids crying, but he still wouldn't let me in. But I think I need help right away. He's on a very short lease with CSHS, and CPS has been involved. And this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am. I'm just waiting to know where you are.
Okay. It's 8119 189th Street, Court East, Puyallup, 98375. And I'd like to pull out of the driveway because I smell gasoline, and he won't let me in.
He won't let you out of the driveway?
He won't let me in the house.
Whose house
He's
is
got the
it?
kids in the house, and he won't let me in. It's a supervised visit.
I understand. Whose house is it?
Josh Powell.
Okay, so you don't live there, right?
No, I don't. No, I'm contracted to the state to provide supervised visitation.
I see. And who is there to exercise their visitation?
I am. And the visit is with Josh Powell.
And who's
And
supervised?
he is the husband that I supervise.
Wait a minute. If it's a supervised visit, you can't supervise yourself. If you're the visitor.
I do supervise myself. I'm the supervisor for the supervised visit.
Okay, well, aren't you the one making the visit? Or is there another
I'm
parent
the one,
that you're supervising?
No, I'm the one that supervises. I pick up the kids as their grandparent.
Yes. And then who visits with the children?
Josh Powell.
Okay, so you're supposed to be there to supervise Josh Powell's visit with the children.
Yes, that's correct.
And how did...
And he's the husband of missing Susan Powell.
This
is a high-profile case.
How did he gain access to the children before you got there?
I was one step in back of them.
Okay, so they went into the house and then he locked you out.
Yeah, he shut the door right in my face.
Now,
and the kids have been in there by now approximately 10 minutes. And he knows this is a supervised visit. 2. Braden is 5 and Charlie is 7.
Is he alone then, or is anybody
I don't know. I couldn't get in the house.
Are you in a vehicle now or on foot?
I'm in a vehicle. I'm in a Prius, a 2010 Prius.
What color
with the doors locked. But he hasn't opened the door. I rang the doorbell and everything.
What color
I begged him to let me in.
Elizabeth, please listen to my questions. What color is the Toyota Prius?
Gray, dark gray.
And the license number?
I don't know. I can look.
All right, we'll have somebody look for you there.
Okay, how long will it be?
I don't know, ma'am. They have to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first. The first available deputy.
Well, this could be life-threatening. He went to court on Wednesday, and he didn't get his kids back. And this is really, I'm afraid for their lives.
All right. We'll have the first available deputy contact you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hello?
Hi, ma'am. Were you calling about the fire in the 8200 block of
yes,
188th Street?
Yes, the house.
Ma'am,
yes,
do you know do you know the exact address of the house, or are you supposed
it's 8119 189th Street, Court East, 2 hours.
Okay, stand line. Do you know if anyone's in the house?
Yes, there was a man and 2 children. I just dropped off the children, and he wouldn't let me in the door.
Okay, stand line for the fire department. Okay, I'm going to get them on the line. Do not hang up. Hold on.
You saw him go back into the house, the flame, right before the flame? He didn't ever leave the house. He just opened the door. The kids were one step ahead of me. They're 5 and 7. They were one step ahead of me, and he slammed the door in my face. Do you think he might have done this intentionally? Yes.
What is this person's name?
His name is Josh Powell. Come in at the sheriff's here.
Okay, go ahead and talk to the officer, ma'am.
This call took place on February 5th, 2012. Before the police could arrive at the scene, the house at 8119 189th Street, Court East, erupted into flames, killing Joshua Powell and his 2 sons, Braden and Charlie Powell, who were trapped inside. Let's start back on January 20th, 1976, when Joshua Powell was born. His parents, Stephen and Terrica Powell, gave birth and raised their kids in Puyallup, Washington. They had married in the Church of Latter-day Saints, but they lost touch with their religion and became disillusioned by the church over time. Stephen was not a great father. Actually, he was far from a great father and husband for that matter. Stephen thought that he had the right to marry multiple women, while his wife Terry was less than thrilled by the idea. Although Terry expressed how she felt about the situation and how she didn't want him to marry another woman, he persisted in finding another lover. he became obsessed with another woman, stalking her and writing songs about this other woman. Stephen became abusive toward Terry and didn't respect her wishes that he remain faithful to her, and eventually it led to a divorce. And Stephen wasn't abusive and hurtful only toward his wife, but to their kids as well. He would specifically pick on and single out Joshua. He would also pit the girls against the boys, and he would expose his young boys to pornography. And he would also verbally as well as physically assault all of them, with Joshua getting the worst of it. Stephen and Terry got divorced when Joshua was around 16 years old. Terry stated that she wanted full custody of the kids because Stephen was not the ideal or safe parent for any of the kids. Unfortunately, the custody of the kids was split up, and so the daughters went to live with their mother Terry, and the sons went to live with their dad Stephen. So the abuse and bad parenting continued for the boys, and no doubt had a negative effect on their upbringing. Joshua was a disturbed young child. At one point, he had threatened to kill his mother with a kitchen knife just because she had asked him to do the dishes. And there were multiple incidences of Joshua killing the family pets. And Joshua even attempted to when he was around 14 years old. But there was a positive light that had entered Joshua's life. At a church event, Joshua met a young woman by the name of Susan Cox. Joshua and Susan started dating straight away. The two fell in love quickly and got engaged shortly after meeting when Susan was only 19 years old. Susan was a happy, bubbly person and felt that she could help Joshua connect deeper with his faith. Susan had always dreamed of becoming a wife and mother, so she was delighted when Joshua asked her to be his wife. However, Susan's parents were not the biggest fans of Joshua. They said they couldn't quite put their finger on it, but something was off about him. Despite her parents' concerns, she was happy with the arrangement and moved forward with the wedding. The first few years of their marriage went pretty well, but Joshua had started having trouble keeping a steady paying job. The couple had to do something to lower their cost of living, so they decided to temporarily move in with Joshua's dad, Stephen. An odd choice given that we know Stephen has a history of abuse toward Joshua, but that's what happened. What could go wrong? While moving in with Stephen did lower their cost of living, it came with other challenges and really put Joshua and Susan's relationship on the rocks. Stephen took a liking to Susan. More than a liking, he was totally taken by Susan and would make sexual advances toward her. Susan had confided in her friends that she had caught Stephen watching her changing clothes in the bedroom. He would even try to sneak into the bathroom to get a glimpse of her while she was there taking a shower. Susan was getting totally creeped out by Stephen. Well, after one too many creepy instances, Susan went to her husband Joshua and told him what was going on, and that she was beginning to feel uncomfortable living with Stephen. Joshua didn't take the news as you'd expect. He sort of just brushed off the whole thing, and then turned it around on Susan by saying that maybe she was leading him on or seducing him or something like that. Susan was less than thrilled with her husband's reaction, but she dealt with it the best she could. She decided to write it off as Stephen was just a bad guy and wasn't a good influence on Joshua. Luckily, eventually Susan and Joshua decided to move out of Stephen's home, and they moved to West Valley City, Utah. In Utah, they could start fresh and repair their somewhat strained relationship. Susan got a new job working for Wells Fargo, and over time she got pregnant and had 2 sons. She gave birth to Charlie in 2005 and Braden in 2007. Susan joined the local church and made a ton of new friends. Susan had fully blossomed in Utah, however, her husband was not adjusting well. Joshua began to get increasingly more controlling of Susan and the boys. He wouldn't let Susan use the family car unless she asked permission. He would make her follow a strict budget and submit a full-on budget report to Joshua that listed every item she bought on a spreadsheet. He even made her knit her own socks instead of purchasing them because it would save the family money. He also started limiting their meals. Joshua even said something to the effect that, well, the boys' school feeds them 1 meal a day, why should I have to feed them again? Things had gotten increasingly worse over time in Susan and Joshua's relationship. Susan convinced Joshua to go to counseling for their relationship. He agreed and attended for a bit, but he gave up on going, and even when he was in counseling, he didn't really participate. Eventually, Susan came to the conclusion that what she needed was a divorce. She went to a divorce lawyer who advised her to make a video documenting all of their belongings in the house. And after the counseling failed to patch things up with their marriage, Susan felt that she had no choice but to come forward and tell Joshua her true feelings. Susan told Joshua that she wanted a divorce. Joshua lost it. He told her over his dead body will she divorce him and take the boys away from him. So, Susan stayed with Joshua, and things only got worse from that point on. She was constantly living in fear of her husband and was being forced to follow his strict rules. With this unfortunate news, Susan wrote out a will and some other legal documentation just in case she were to pass away. Some of these papers and documents were later discovered. Susan had also written, quote, "I want my marriage to work out. I've told my husband he's depressed or has issues, and we, as a family of 4, are not happy and not showing how a husband and wife should interact. That we are messing up our children. He doesn't want to do counseling and says, if I were to buy groceries for cheap sale prices, these prices don't exist now with the cost of gas going up, etc., that he would be happy with this well-purchased bargain deal food in his stomach and would make him happy and our marital problems would be solved. He also said he's mean to me because of the Republicans," direct quote, and he mentioned something about how terrible our economy is because of the Republicans, and if that were fixed, he wouldn't have these problems. There was a note that read, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. Please take care of my boys. I want my parents Judy and Chuck Cox very involved and in charge of their lives. If they aren't there, my sister can hopefully be responsible. I love my boys. I live for them, and I choose not to cheat or do drugs because I wouldn't want to risk losing them. I love you, Charlie and Braden, and I'm sorry you've seen how wrong and messed up our marriage is. I would never leave you." But Susan hoped that things would get better and that she would be around for the boys for a long time. Fast forward to December 6th, 2009. Susan had taken the boys with her to church. She wasn't allowed to use the car that day, so they walked to church. And when church let out, Susan and the boys walked home with one of Susan's friends from choir. The friend came home with Susan and they hung out for a while. Eventually, the friend left around 5 p.m. and Susan decided she wanted to lie down and take a nap while Joshua wanted to take the boys out to go sledding. Monday, December 7th, 2009, Braden and Charlie didn't show up to school. The school tried to reach out to their parents, Susan and Joshua, but couldn't get a hold of either of them. So then they called their place of work, and it turned out that neither Susan nor Joshua had shown up to work that day, and they had not heard from them. So the school teacher went back and looked over the kids' paperwork and emergency contact numbers for the boys. She found Joshua's sister is listed as one of the in case of emergency contacts. So she rang up the sister. The sister answered, but didn't have a clue where they were and had not heard from Joshua or Susan. She asked their mom, Joshua's mom, and she hadn't heard from them either, so they decided it was time to call the police. They head over to Joshua's house and give the police permission to break into the house. They break in through a window and find that for the most part everything looks completely normal, except that Susan's purse is still in the house, but no sign of Susan. And then there were 2 box fans set up that were turned on and pointed to a big wet spot in the living room. But Susan, Joshua, Braden, and Charlie are still nowhere to be found. Both sides of the family now are in full panic mode. They try calling both Susan and Joshua's cell phones over and over, but no answer. They got the whole neighborhood and church community involved by looking for the Powell family. Eventually, Joshua and the 2 kids rolled up to the house early that evening of December 7th. The neighborhood is obviously relieved, but they were like, you need to go talk to the police and tell them you've been all right because everyone's been looking for you. So Joshua goes over to the West Valley City Police to check in. The police conduct an informal interview with Joshua like, where were you and where's your wife? Joshua starts telling the police this bizarre story. He said that he took the kids sledding and then came home. They watched a movie, but they don't remember what the movie is that they watched, but he thinks it was a Christmas movie. Well, around midnight, the boys really wanted to make and eat s'mores, so Joshua decided to take the boys camping so they could make real s'mores. So at midnight in December, in the middle of a blizzard, Joshua packs up his 2-year-old and his 4-year-old in the car and drove 2 hours all the way to Simpson Spring Campgrounds. He said Susan was still asleep and he didn't bother to wake her up. Just he and the boys hit the road to go camping. His story was very elaborate. He said they got to the campsite around 2:00 a.m. He started to build a fire and realized he had forgotten to pack the chocolate, so they just had graham crackers and marshmallows. Then the next day, December 7th, they packed up and drove back home and drove over to the police station. So the police asked him why he didn't call into work and let them know he wouldn't be coming in. He replied saying that he didn't realize December 7th was a Monday. He thought it was still Sunday and that he didn't have to work, which sounds pretty suspicious if you ask me. The police aren't really believing his story either, so during the interview, they have an officer called the Simpson Spring Campground to confirm that Joshua and his sons had in fact been there at the campsite. The campground said that there was no evidence that anyone had been to the campground for weeks. The officers tell Joshua they are glad that he and his children are okay and unharmed, but there's still no sign of Susan. Joshua replies like, "Oh yeah, everything's probably fine, she's just probably at work." And they're like, "Nah, we checked and she's definitely not there." Joshua is still cool as a cucumber and not alarmed at all. He tells the police it's probably fine, I'll check in with some friends and family. Maybe she took the day off knowing that I was out camping with the boys and she took some time off too. The police are still concerned, so they'll file a missing persons report and ask Joshua to come back to the station the following day for a more proper and formal interview. Well, the next day, December 8th, Joshua called his father-in-law and explained that Susan is missing and he's going in for an interview. Joshua shows up 4 hours late to the interview. So they ask a bunch of the same questions they did the day before, and Joshua answers them just the same. The police still feel like something's off about Joshua and his answers, so a few days later, he's scheduled to have a third formal interview with the police. But instead of attending the interview, Joshua hired an attorney. He didn't agree to the interview, but he did agree to give a DNA sample. This kind of led the police to a dead end. There's still no sign of Susan, and no leads to go on. And as much as they had suspected Joshua had something to do with her disappearance, they had no proof connecting him to it. So the month of December continues and the case runs cold. Joshua moves back to Washington with the kids and moves in with his dad Stephen after he once again got let go of his job. The police are still trying to solve the case. Independent search teams scattered across Utah are still on the hunt for Susan. The police obtained a search warrant for the Powell family minivan that they took camping, but nothing significant came from that search either. Then in February, Susan's family and friends hold a press conference where they start to shed light on Susan and Joshua's troubled relationship. They begin to paint Joshua in a negative light, revealing that he was controlling and that Susan was in fear of her life. They even talked about how Susan wanted a divorce, and Joshua said over his dead body. Then out of nowhere, Joshua and Stephen do an interview together where they start saying that Susan had been having an affair before her disappearance. They said that she was seeing a man in town who was a journalist and that he is now also missing. They speculated that Susan and the journalist had run off to Brazil together. But there's nothing linking these two people together, no evidence that either of these two people ever met. Joshua and Stephen also create a website, the official website of Susan Powell. But instead of this website being a resource and call to action to bringing Susan home, it was actually a website that was bashing on Susan. They were posting hateful things about Susan, slandering her name and her character. They said she was a sexual deviant and a horrible mother who hated her children and hated her life in Utah. All of these things that simply were not true at all. Susan loved her kids, the church, her friends, and her life. The only negative thing in Susan's life was her husband Joshua. And Stephen, Susan's father-in-law, started speaking out and saying when Susan was around, she would always try to seduce him. He said that they shared, quote, father-in-law, daughter-in-law flirting with each other. Maybe some sexual touching. Frankly, I liked it. So then the state of Utah and the state of Washington issued a search warrant for father-in-law Stephen's home. In their search, the police come across multiple hard drives and computers full of child pornography. They also found thousands of pictures of Susan, all sorts of pictures of Susan, and it appears that she had no idea these photos were being taken. There was even sketchy video footage of Susan leaving her job and getting into her car. The video is being shot from across the parking lot, inside another car, and Susan has no idea she's being filmed. They also found these plastic bags, like a bag of hair that was labeled with Susan's name and a date on it, and a plastic bag of toenail clippings with Susan's name and date on it. They also found another plastic bag of used women's hygiene products with, yes, Susan's name and date on it. They also found a ton of other creepy stuff in Stephen's house. And this is at the same time that Joshua and his two sons were also living in the house. So Stephen then gets arrested with 14 charges that include voyeurism, possession of child and more. So with all these terrifying discoveries inside the home, the state got involved and decided that the kids, Braden and Charlie, should not be living with Joshua and Stephen under these conditions. They grant Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, custody of the boys, and by this time the boys were about 4 and 6 years old. Susan's parents noticed that the boys were behaving kind of badly. They'd grown very violent toward each other and were very defiant. So while living with the grandparents, one of the kids drew a picture and described it out loud. He drew a picture of the family minivan. He goes on to point out that that's Daddy, that's Charlie, that's Braden, and then points out saying, and that's Mommy in the trunk. But when they pressed him about the picture and asked him about it, he said he isn't supposed to talk about camping and that it's a secret. The kid could not be swayed. He could not talk further about why Mommy's in the trunk or what really happened when they went camping. While the boys were still in care of their grandparents, Joshua still had some parental rights to the kids. He was still allowed to have supervised visitations with his sons. So this brings us back to the very beginning of this episode with that disturbing 911 phone call. After the court ruling that Susan's parents would have official custody of Charlie and Braden, there was a scheduled supervised visit set up for Joshua and the boys for February 5th, 2012. The supervisor came to the residence and knocked on the door. Joshua answered the door, but he won't let the supervisor in. He quickly slammed the door in her face. When he had opened the door, she smelled gasoline and could hear the kids crying in the background, but she couldn't get inside to check on them and see if they were all right. She tried the door handle, but it was locked, and she kept banging on the door, but he wouldn't open up. So she went back to her car, called 911, gave them the address, and had the most unhelpful 911 operator ever. The operator couldn't seem to figure out what this social worker needed or what was going on, but the bottom line was she was trying to get across that she needed help and she needed it fast. After talking to the operator for 6 minutes, he finally says that they will send someone over to check things out. But before the proper authorities were able to show up, the house erupted in flames. The social worker calls the police again, so eventually the fire department and the police showed up. But like I said, it was already too late. Joshua, Braden, and Charlie were all dead. It seemed that Joshua had physically assaulted the boys and then poured gasoline all over the place and lit the house on fire. It was later discovered that Joshua had sent out an email to the custody attorney before the fire. In the email, he apologized to everyone he had ever hurt. He said, "I love you all, and goodbye." The emails did not specifically say that he had killed his wife Susan, but he had definitely alluded to it. And to this day, Susan Powell has still not been found.